The last time Allara Vance had worn heels, her grandmother had still been alive. Her hair had been shorter then, and she had carried a quiet, stubborn belief that love could be approached like a system, something orderly, something that could be found, labeled, and preserved if only you followed the right method. It had seemed simple, almost logical, as if the human heart could be archived like any other fragile artifact. 7 years passed, and that certainty dissolved into something less structured. On this particular night, she found herself in heels again, black ones, modest in design, lifting her just enough to feel unsteady, as though she stood on the edge of something small but significant. They were not her choice. Priya had selected them with her usual decisiveness, brushing aside any resistance with effortless authority. Resistance had always been inefficient with Priya, acceptance was quicker. Simone had been there too, quiet and observant, offering support through presence rather than words while Allara's carefully ordered closet spilled into temporary chaos. Allara had questioned the necessity of it all, insisting that meeting a stranger for drinks did not warrant such orchestration. Yet the argument had dissolved under the simple truth that she rarely stepped outside her routines, and tonight required something different. That was how she ended up seated in a corner booth at a place called the Velvet Echo, a room suspended somewhere between beauty and excess. Midnight, blue velvet softened the space, while amber lights hung like distant stars, casting a glow that blurred edges and deepened shadows. A piano rested near the low stage, worn with the quiet dignity of something long cherished. The room carried a deliberate intimacy, as though every detail had been arranged to encourage connection. She had chosen her seat with intention, granting herself a clear view of both the entrance and the stage. It was not anxiety, she told herself, but awareness, a professional habit of understanding space and placement, of recognizing how context shaped meaning. Her work had trained her to notice such things, to read environments as carefully as documents. Positioning herself here was simply another extension of that instinct. A glass of bourbon sat untouched before her, chosen less out of desire and more out of obligation to expectation. It looked right in her hand, fitting the atmosphere in a way chamomile tea never could. She watched the amber liquid catch the light, then checked the time. 42 minutes had passed. The man she had agreed to meet had not arrived. His absence had not been entirely unexpected. When Priya first arranged the meeting, Allara had approached it with methodical curiosity, gathering what little information she could. A name, a profession, a photograph that revealed very little. She had researched him with quiet thoroughness, constructing an image that felt complete but not compelling. He seemed competent, observant, but lacking curiosity, a combination she found quietly disappointing. Still, she had come. Recently, she had begun to suspect that a life contained entirely within familiar routines might not be enough. The thought unsettled her, but it lingered. Music drifted through the room, soft and fluid, carried by a trio whose restraint made each note feel deliberate. It became the most compelling part of the evening, drawing her attention away from the empty chair across from her. She let herself listen, truly listen, noticing the silence between notes, the same kind of silence she knew from the archive where she worked. It was a silence she had once loved, one she had built her life around. Tonight it felt different, not peaceful but hollow. She was still tracing that feeling when someone slid into the seat across from her. The movement was smooth, assured as though it belonged there. The woman wore a black coat marked by wear, her appearance suggesting both care and disruption, as if something precise had been interrupted midway. Her face held a striking specificity, features that resisted easy categorization, and eyes that carried the weight of someone accustomed to attention but presently burdened by it. There were shadows beneath those eyes, and her composure seemed held together by deliberate effort. When she spoke, her voice was low and textured, shaped by ease rather than refinement. She asked to be recognized, and Allara admitted that she did not know her. In that instant, something shifted in the woman's expression, a rapid, silent recalculation, her gaze flickering briefly toward the entrance before returning. A decision formed there, quick and certain, as though she had already measured the risk and accepted it. She leaned forward slightly, her presence settling into the space with quiet intensity, and chose a different path forward, one that required nothing more than belief in a carefully constructed illusion. She asked for 5 minutes, her voice carrying a quiet urgency softened by restraint. The word please lingered in the air with a weight Allara did not immediately understand. It was a word she knew well, one that shaped her daily interactions, a polite structure that kept conversations balanced and predictable. She used it herself with intention, aware of its role in maintaining order. Yet this was different. The word was not casual or habitual. It felt offered rather than spoken, extended with a fragile kind of trust that acknowledged how little protection it provided. It carried risk. The woman across from her held herself together with visible effort, her composure carefully maintained despite the strain beneath it. That effort spoke clearly to Allara, who had built her life around reading surfaces for the truths they concealed. Something immediate and unresolved was unfolding, and a decision had already been made, not about Allara as a person, but about the situation, the empty chair, the quiet booth, the presence of someone who appeared safer than whatever alternative existed. Allara's gaze drifted toward the entrance. A man stood there, scanning the room with deliberate focus. His posture was alert, searching, his movements slow and methodical. He did not belong to the softness of the space. When she looked back, the decision settled into place. Agreement came easily, almost instinctively. The woman exhaled, relief slipping through in a way that suggested she had been holding her breath far longer than the moment required. Gratitude followed, quiet but genuine. A shift occurred. The woman straightened, her composure reforming into something smoother, more controlled. Warmth entered her voice, layered carefully over fatigue. It was not dishonesty, but craft, an intentional performance shaped with precision, like someone stepping into a role and maintaining it with skill. She spoke as though they already belonged to each other's company, commenting on the table with an ease that felt practiced. Allara responded in kind, surprised by how naturally the rhythm formed. There was a flicker of recognition in the woman's expression, a brief spark of amusement at the unexpected alignment. The conversation unfolded with quiet precision. Observations about the room turned into something deeper, revealing the difference between choosing comfort and choosing awareness. Allara admitted her preference for information over ease, for understanding over appearance. The distinction felt natural to her, though rarely spoken aloud. The man at the entrance moved further inside, his search continuing. The woman did not look directly at him, yet her stillness carried awareness. It was a controlled attention, peripheral but exact, the kind that tracked everything without revealing itself. Allara recognized it immediately. It was the same instinct she carried into her own work, the ability to manage multiple layers of attention at once. A name was offered, quiet and deliberate. Allara gave her own in return, and the exchange carried more weight than simple introduction. The woman softened slightly at the edges, something unguarded slipping through before being carefully contained again. Juniper became her name, and it fit with an immediacy that felt undeniable. It held a specificity that matched the woman herself, something distinct and unrepeatable. There was curiosity in Juniper's gaze now, real and unperformed, reaching outward with genuine interest. Allara spoke of her work, of preserving fragments of meaning, letters, maps, objects that once mattered deeply and might again. She described the quiet responsibility of holding on to significance until the world was ready to recognize it. The words came more freely than she expected, revealing something she usually kept contained. Juniper listened with an attentiveness that shifted subtly into something deeper, something that brushed against recognition. Her response carried a softness that felt sincere, untouched by performance. When she spoke of her own work, she did so simply. She sang. The statement was understated, almost deliberately so, as though reducing something large into something manageable. It was a form of protection, a careful shaping of truth into something less exposed. Allara took in the details, the worn coat, the unfinished hair, the shadows beneath Juniper's eyes, and understood that something about this moment did not align with the ordinary. There was a tension beneath the surface, a sense of movement, of escape. She chose not to press. Some things required patience, and instinct told her that direct questions would fracture whatever fragile structure had formed. Instead, the shape of their shared fiction was clarified. A history was constructed with quiet efficiency, details offered just enough to hold together under observation. It felt surprisingly natural, the way both of them stepped into it without hesitation. A small realization surfaced when Juniper described her habits too accurately, noticing details that should not have been visible in such a short span of time. The precision of it suggested experience, or perhaps recognition born from similarity. The observation lingered, sharp and exact. The untouched bourbon between them became part of the story. It reflected an effort to belong, to match expectation rather than desire. Allara admitted as much, the honesty slipping out before she could reshape it. Juniper received it without judgment, her attention steady and unguarded now. The question of who Allara had been waiting for settled into the space between them, answered with quiet matter, of factness. A name, a delay, a situation arranged by someone who believed her life needed more. The truth of that lingered. It resisted dismissal, holding its place with quiet insistence. Allara acknowledged it, not fully but enough. Juniper's silence shifted again, losing its earlier calculation and taking on warmth. It became something present and genuine, a kind of attention that did not demand anything in return. It was no longer performance. It was simply there, steady and real, filling the space between them in a way that felt unexpectedly significant. This was simply the way she listened, steady and attentive, absorbing more than most people noticed. The man at the bar turned again, scanning the room with greater precision, his focus sharpening as he moved closer to their direction. Juniper spoke quietly, her tone calm but prepared, shaped by experience rather than fear. She carried the kind of readiness that came from having needed it before, from learning how to manage difficult moments without letting them show. Allara matched her quiet, her attention narrowing. There was a brief hesitation before Juniper answered, small enough to escape notice for most but not for Allara. She recognized it as she recognized all small fractures in composure. Juniper explained that he wanted a story, one she had not chosen to give. Allara followed the line of thought quickly, her mind moving with practical clarity. The name surfaced with certainty, drawn from a memory she had built through careful research. When she spoke it, Juniper went completely still. The details came together with quiet precision. A freelance journalist, known for entertainment coverage, with a history that suggested ethical compromise rather than error. Work removed not for inaccuracy, but for crossing boundaries that should have remained intact. Information taken without consent. The contrast lingered between reputation and reality. Priya's endorsement hovered faintly in memory, weighed against a pattern that told a different story. Juniper watched her closely. The performance gone now. What remained was exhaustion, and beneath it something fragile. Not quite hope, but close enough to grow into it if given the right conditions. Allara explained the connection, the planned meeting that had never been the true purpose of the evening. The realization settled with clarity. He had not come for a date. He had come for Juniper. Juniper closed her eyes for a brief moment, containing something far larger than the gesture itself. It was precise, controlled, and deeply felt, the kind of expression that resonated beyond its size. When she opened them again, acceptance had already formed. The decision that followed came quickly. Leaving was the only logical step. Juniper looked at her fully then, without the protective layers she had maintained before. The question behind her gaze carried weight, shaped by experience, by a learned caution toward unexpected kindness. Allara considered it seriously. The answer was simple, grounded in something immediate and undeniable. The request had been genuine, and that was enough. They moved through the back of the Velvet Echo, guided without hesitation by Constance, who required no explanation. The transition from the dim warmth of the club to the brightness of the kitchen was abrupt. Light, sound, and motion filled the space, the air thick with the scent of butter and citrus. The staff worked with practiced confidence, focused and efficient, their attention never straying toward the two women passing through. A heavy door opened into a narrow alley, and the night met them with a sharp, familiar cold. Manhattan in October carried a chill that felt more deliberate than the temperature suggested, shaped by the architecture of the city itself. The wind moved with intention, threading through the buildings and settling into the spaces between them. Allara felt it settle into her shoulders, a reminder of the city's density, its constant insistence on being more than expected. Juniper drew her coat tighter, silent for a moment as the sounds of the club faded behind them and the city rose to meet them from both ends of the alley. Traffic, distant horns, the low, constant hum of movement filled the air like a living presence. Gratitude came quietly, offered without embellishment. Allara acknowledged it, though the situation remained uncertain. The absence of a plan lingered, an unspoken reality that neither of them had considered in the urgency of leaving. The night stretched ahead without direction. Juniper looked at her, and for the first time, something unguarded appeared, a real smile, small and unexpected, edged with surprise as if it had arrived before she had decided to allow it. Neither of them knew where they were going, and that uncertainty settled between them without discomfort. They began to walk. Later, this part would resist easy explanation. Not because it was unclear, but because it held a strange balance between ordinary and meaningful, the kind of experience that defied simplification. There was nothing extraordinary in the action itself. They walked out of the alley, turned north without discussion, and entered the city as it existed at night. Manhattan unfolded around them, bright and alive, its artificial light no longer harsh but honest, a clear declaration of presence against the dark. The streets carried movement and energy, a quiet insistence of life continuing in all directions. They did not speak at first. The silence between them had changed. It no longer carried expectation or anticipation. It moved with them, becoming something shared rather than empty. It felt less like an absence and more like a companion. Allara was familiar with silence, comfortable within it in most contexts. Yet silence with strangers usually held a tension, an unspoken pressure to fill it. This silence carried none of that. It existed without demand, shaped perhaps by the strangeness of the evening, or by something inherent in Juniper herself, a lack of fear toward what silence might reveal. When Juniper finally spoke, it came without prompting, a simple observation grounded in absence. She had not walked anywhere in weeks. Allara absorbed the statement, understanding it as a condition rather than a complaint. Movement had been replaced by transit, by controlled entries and exits, by the contained spaces of cars and back doors. It was a life adjusted to, but not fully accepted. Juniper described it plainly, the reality of navigating the city without truly being in it. Months had passed with only fragments of the place experienced through windows and thresholds. Her past surfaced in pieces. Touring Chicago, a stretch of time that resisted easy summary. Then Brooklyn, earlier and clearer, a place tied to memory and movement. She had once known the city through walking, through time and repetition, through the way light shifted across buildings at different hours. That understanding had shaped her idea of what a city was meant to be. Something experienced fully, not observed from a distance. Something that required presence, the way a book required reading from beginning to end. Allara recognized the truth in that immediately. Juniper glanced at her, absorbing the way Allara spoke about movement and space. Allara explained that maps were records of how people moved through the world. that the earliest ones were shaped by walking, by bodies learning landscapes step by step. Cities had once been experienced directly, understood through presence and repetition. When they shifted into places navigated by cars, something fundamental changed. People began living inside a reduced version of the city, a summary instead of the full experience. She paused, aware she had gone on longer than expected, but Juniper did not dismiss it. There was a new attentiveness in her expression, not surprise but recognition of something unexpected and worth holding on to. Allara spoke about her work with quiet certainty, without apology. She loved it, and she said so plainly. Juniper noticed the difference immediately, the absence of that habitual softening people often applied when describing what mattered to them. Most people expected boredom and tried to protect themselves from it in advance. They minimized before anyone else could. The observation landed with precision, carrying the sense of something learned through experience. Allara considered it in silence, the city moving around them with its constant background rhythm. The thought of minimizing, of making oneself smaller before being reduced by others, lingered. Juniper admitted that she did exactly that offstage. It was constant, almost instinctive. Onstage, everything reversed. Emotion expanded, presence intensified, the distance between herself and the audience filled with something larger than her ordinary self. The contrast between those states made the offstage world feel narrow, difficult to inhabit. She described it as feeling small, like wearing something that almost fit but never quite did. Allara understood the shape of that feeling, even if her version of it moved in the opposite direction. She was fully at ease within her work, precise and capable, but outside of it, in spaces that required spontaneity and performance, she felt uncertain. Competence came naturally to her. Care came naturally, but presence without structure, without something to manage, remained unfamiliar. She admitted that uncertainty, the hesitation forming carefully before it became words. Spontaneity did not belong to her skill set. Being fully present without the framework of responsibility felt like stepping into something undefined. Her reason for coming out that night followed naturally from that admission. A friend had insisted that her life lacked enough people, and she had been unable to argue convincingly against it. The logic of that lingered, quietly undeniable. Juniper responded with a soft sound that carried warmth, something close to laughter but gentler. The honesty of the statement stood out, unembellished and direct. Allara acknowledged that she did not disguise her motivations, even when they reflected poorly on her. It was less exhausting than maintaining something artificial. Their path brought them to a small park, the kind that existed quietly between buildings, carefully maintained but easily overlooked. Iron benches lined a pale stone path, and at its center stood a single tree, fully transformed by October. Its leaves had turned a deep, luminous gold, intensified by the light cast upward from a ground lamp. Against the dark backdrop of the city, it seemed almost unreal, too vivid to belong entirely to its surroundings. They stopped without needing to decide to stop. Allara looked at the tree, taking in its clarity, while beside her Juniper exhaled slowly. It was not exhaustion or sadness, but release. When Allara glanced at her, she saw something different, an openness that had not been there before. Juniper's expression was unguarded, unshaped by intention, simply present. She looked tired, undeniably so, but also striking in a way that came from letting the performance fall away. For the first time that evening, it felt as though she had stopped running, even if only for a moment. The conversation shifted again, returning briefly to the man from earlier. Allara explained her habit of learning about people before meeting them, not out of obsession but out of preference for context. Understanding made interactions clearer, more legible. Most people relied on first impressions and adjusted later, but she found that process inefficient and uncomfortable. Her approach sometimes left her with more information than others expected, which could be unsettling. Still, she accepted that trade-off. She shared what she had learned, focusing on what mattered. His ethical issues were not about incorrect facts, but about how those facts were obtained. The distinction carried weight. When she asked about the situation, she did not press. She allowed space for the answer, waiting with the same patience she brought to her work, where meaning revealed itself only when given time. Juniper eventually spoke, her voice steady. The issue was not about her directly, but about her family. Her younger brother had made mistakes, financial ones that carried legal consequences. He had resolved them, fulfilled every requirement, and moved forward. Time had passed, and he had rebuilt his life. Yet the past remained vulnerable to distortion. If exposed in the wrong context, it could be reshaped into something else entirely, something that would attach itself to her name, her work, her reputation. It would become a story that was not hers, but one she would still have to carry. The way the information had been obtained mattered just as much. It was not the result of careful reporting, but of opportunism, of someone looking for something to sell. Allara listened closely, noting not only what was said but how it was said. The structure was careful, deliberate. Juniper offered the truth without turning it into a request. She shared it freely, without expectation. The pieces aligned, the arranged meeting, the timing, the presence of the journalist. It had been a calculated entry, a way to gain access under the appearance of something harmless. Juniper confirmed it quietly. She had already been managing her movements carefully, aware that attention was building around her. But in a social setting, the boundaries blurred. Removing someone became more complicated when they appeared as just another person in the room. The involvement of Priya fit into that pattern, not through intention but through coincidence and trust misplaced. The reality settled between them. He would notice their absence. He would begin looking. Time, already limited, would narrow further. Juniper turned toward Allara, the openness still present, shaped now by the weight of everything that had been said. She acknowledged that this was her problem, something Allara had no obligation to share in. Their connection had begun by chance, built on convenience. Allara accepted that truth easily, but she did not step away from it. She looked once more at the golden tree, then back at Juniper, the moment settling into clarity. She had spent nearly an hour questioning why she had come out at all, wondering if she would ever find herself in a situation that justified the discomfort of stepping outside her carefully controlled life. Then Juniper had appeared, and everything had shifted. Allara did not believe in signs. She believed in evidence, in what could be observed and experienced directly. The evidence before her was simple and undeniable. In the last 30 minutes, she had been more fully herself than she had been in the 47 that came before. The difference was clear, and she chose to remain where that clarity existed rather than return to something hollow and performative. She asked what was needed. The silence that followed settled differently than before. It was not heavy or moving, but quiet in a deeper way, like standing at the edge of something unexpected. Juniper spoke plainly. She needed time, distance, and space long enough to ensure her brother's safety. He was with her, staying at her hotel, brought there intentionally so she could keep him close and protected. The situation carried urgency, shaped by the risk of exposure before she could control the narrative surrounding it. Allara listened and responded with certainty. The situation with the journalist was not without leverage. She outlined what she knew: the formal complaint, the documented ethical violations, the withdrawn article that spoke more about conduct than accuracy. The details were not legally decisive but professionally damaging. They were enough. She explained her plan without embellishment. Information could be used in return, not as spectacle but as pressure. If he moved forward improperly, she would respond in kind, assembling what she knew and placing it where it would matter most. It was not dramatic, not permanent, but it was sufficient. Juniper absorbed this, the weight of it settling into the space between them. The city continued around them, indifferent and constant, while the golden tree cast its steady light. For a moment, Juniper simply looked at her, as though trying to understand what stood in front of her. The question came naturally, shaped by surprise rather than suspicion. Allara felt the shift in herself, something larger than the precise awareness she usually carried. It was unfamiliar, a quiet warmth that came from being seen without effort or arrangement. Recognition not constructed but given freely. She answered simply. She was an archivist. That was explanation enough for her. Juniper's expression softened with quiet amusement, the answer both insufficient and complete. For Allara, it contained everything that mattered. The moment lingered, held together by the unlikely convergence of choices that had brought them there: the heels, the waiting, the decision to stay, the decision to leave. Allara allowed herself to remain in it without reducing it, without making it smaller for the sake of comfort. She let it exist fully, as it was. Liam arrived minutes later. He approached from the far end of the park, his presence marked by a tension that suggested plans interrupted. His patience had thinned into something sharper. The camera in his hand, not yet raised, was visible enough to declare intent. Allara had already seen him coming. She adjusted her position slightly, stepping just forward of Juniper. It was not a shield, not an overt gesture, just a deliberate placement. He stopped when he reached them, his attention moving between them as he assessed the situation. He spoke, attempting to reclaim control of the moment. Allara answered before Juniper could, her tone even and composed. The time he had already been given stood in quiet contrast to his request. He had chosen not to use it. His attention shifted to her fully then, recalculating. She was not what he had expected, not part of the plan he had prepared for. She dismissed his attempt at apology with calm clarity, moving directly to what mattered. His method of entry, his intention, the use of mutual connections as leverage. None of it interested her. What mattered was what she knew. She laid it out precisely, each detail delivered without emphasis but with complete certainty. The complaint, the withdrawn piece, the documented correspondence, the accessible records. She stated her role plainly. Finding things was what she did. The consequence followed naturally. If he chose to proceed in the way he had before, she would respond thoroughly, efficiently, and in a way that would reach the people who needed to see it. She was not angry. She was clear. The effect was immediate. Silence settled, sharp and evaluative, as he reconsidered his position. The balance had shifted. He lowered the camera, the calculation resolving in a different direction. The moment passed without resolution in his favor. He withdrew, leaving the park and the situation behind. The space returned to itself once he was gone. The tree remained steady and unchanged, its light continuing without regard for what had happened beneath it. Juniper stood in silence, the weight of the moment still moving through her. Allara waited, allowing it to settle. When Juniper finally spoke, it carried a note of disbelief shaped by experience. What had just happened did not fit into the patterns she was used to. Allara responded with quiet precision. She had not issued a threat. She had described a likely course of action. The distinction lingered, and then Juniper laughed. The sound was unexpected, genuine, and unrestrained at its edges. It carried something released, something that had been held back for longer than necessary. It shifted the atmosphere around them, subtle but undeniable. She spoke again, this time more softly, acknowledging something she had not experienced before. Someone stepping forward without calculation, without asking what they would gain. Allara considered that carefully. The truth was not simple, but it was clear enough. She had not acted out of strategy. She had acted because the situation required it, because she was present and capable. There was something else too, something still forming into language. The walk, the conversation, the tree, the moment itself. She answered as honestly as she could. She gained the experience of being there, in that moment, in that conversation, in whatever this was becoming. That was sufficient. Juniper turned toward her, the golden light resting between them. It softened the edges of everything, giving the moment a sense of preservation, as though it might endure beyond itself. Allara saw her clearly then, not as a surface but as something layered, shaped by history and movement and choice. She realized she had been looking all along and had not once wanted to look away. Juniper admitted uncertainty, not as weakness but as careful consideration, as though acknowledging something that required attention rather than avoidance. Allara removed the need for resolution. There was nothing to solve in that moment. Standing there was enough. Juniper accepted that, lifting her gaze briefly to the tree, the city stretching above and beyond it. The exhaustion remained, but something lighter had settled over it. Not an ending, but a pause, a release from carrying something heavy. She asked to see where Allara worked. The request landed with quiet surprise. It was unexpected but not unwelcome. Allara considered it and agreed, the possibility of morning replacing the uncertainty of the night. Juniper reached into her coat and produced a pen. Along with the napkin she had carried from the club, she wrote quickly, deliberately, then left it resting on a nearby bench. The plan was simple: morning. They parted without ceremony. Juniper moved back toward the city lights, her figure blending into the constant motion of the streets. Allara remained for a moment. She approached the bench and picked up the napkin carefully, instinct guiding the way she handled it, as though it were something worth preserving. The handwriting was distinct, precise, unmistakably individual. She placed it safely in her coat pocket and stood beneath the golden tree for a final moment, the cold settling around her, the city continuing its endless rhythm. She thought about why she had come out that night, about the quiet insistence that her life needed more. The realization settled with clarity. It had been true, though not in the way it had first been meant.